Hello, welcome to my Romeo and Juliet Act 1 review. So, before you start reading, one thing you're going to want to keep in mind is that in this play, there are two families that hate each other. This is a driving force of the play. We've talked about it a little bit, but there are Capulets and Montagues. Capulets and Montagues hate each other. They've hated each other for generations. It's not ever specified why in the text. However, we can assume that they've hated each other for so long that they might not even know why themselves. There will be some neutral parties, like the prince. However, most of the people in the text will either be aligned with the Capulets or Montagues. Either they're related to them, or they're friends with them, or they work for them. This play takes place in Verona, Italy in the 1500s. All right, so scene 1 opens up with two servants. They are walking around town, running some errands. They work for the Capulets when they spot two Montague servants. Again, these families hate each other. They just work for the families, but they hate them too. So they're like, hey, I'm going to do this thing where I bite my thumb at them, which essentially was their way of giving the middle finger. And naturally, the Montague servants see this and they get mad. So they're like, hey, let's fight. They fight. So while they're fighting, this guy Benvolio spots it happening and he's like, oh my gosh, I should do something. Benvolio is a Montague, but he's also a good guy who most of the time is just going to want peace. So he's like, hey, guys, stop fighting. However, he ends up just making things worse, and then all these people are fighting in the middle of town. The prince ends up having to show up, and he's like, guys, stop. And he's also kind of like, you guys have been doing this for far too long. I don't want to have to break up another fight. If I do, there will be consequences. I'm a little annoyed. So, fight breaks up. Then Benvolio is kind of like, oh man, wandering around. He's like, I'm going to go find Romeo, because I think Romeo's kind of sad, and he's my friend and also my cousin. So he finds Romeo, and Romeo is a little bummed, and Benvolio's like, what's up? What's wrong? And Romeo's like, well, I'm kind of in love with this girl, Rosalind, but she wants to become a nun, and, that means we can't get married, and I'm a little heartbroken about it. And he's going on about love, blah, blah, blah. And Benvolio's kind of just like, well, life will go on, Romeo, it'll be okay. I don't really know what to say. So that's the end of scene 1. Scene 2 opens up with the Capulets. So Mr. Capulet is walking with this guy, Paris. And Paris is like, hey, Mr. Capulet, your daughter is like 13, right? I think I want to marry her. And Mr. Capulet's kind of like, well, she's a little young, but I'll tell you what, we're having a party. So come to our party later, meet her. If she likes you, you have my blessing. It'll be good. So then he's like, oh, also, servant, let's go give out the invitations to the party, because we haven't done that yet. So he sends his servant with all these invitations to deliver them to the people around town. However, the servant can't read, and he's like, well, how am I supposed to see who is supposed to get an invitation? So he wanders around town, and he runs into Benvolio and Romeo, and he's like, hey guys, do you think you can help me? I can't read. And they're like, sure. So they help him figure out where the invitations are supposed to go. And then he goes and he leaves, and they're kind of like, hey, the Capulets are having this big party later. We know that our family and their family doesn't really get along, but it could be something fun to do. And Benvolio's like, hey, Romeo, you could maybe cheer up a little bit. And Romeo's like, okay, fine, I'll go. So then we have scene 3. And now we're back at the Capulets' place. So Juliet's kind of just chilling in her room when her mom and her nurse, which is essentially just an assistant, walk in, and they're kind of just talking. And her mom's like, hey, how do you feel about marriage? Juliet's like, And her mom's like, well, there's this guy, Paris. So then her mom starts talking to her about Paris, trying to convince her that Paris is this good guy. The nurse kind of takes over the conversation and then just starts spewing stories about Juliet as a baby. She tells this weird story where she's like, when you were a baby, you fell and you hit your head and you started to cry. and we couldn't get you to stop crying until my husband was like, hey, Juliet, you fell, you hit your head, you're going to fall backwards a lot when you're older, right? And apparently baby Juliet stopped crying when he said this and was like, yep. And the nurse finds this hysterical. This is because falling backwards in their time apparently meant having sex. So when Juliet had fallen and hit her head, and the husband said, oh, you fell, you're going to fall a lot when you're older, Juliet had stopped crying and said, yes, essentially saying, yeah, I'm going to have a lot of sex when I'm older. So the nurse finds this story very funny. Poor baby Juliet didn't realize, obviously, what she was saying, but the nurse keeps telling this story. Eventually, Juliet and the mom are like, yo, enough. The mom is like, okay, but Paris, whatever. And Juliet's like, fine, I'll get all dolled up for this party. I'll go and meet Paris. We'll see what happens. So then, next scene, we're in scene 4. Romeo, Benvolio, and Mercutio are walking to the party. They're kind of just chatting. Romeo is still feeling down in the dumps when Mercutio starts talking about this mythical creature, Queen Mab. Queen Mab is essentially just a fairy who goes and messes with people's dreams, which in turn will then mess with maybe decisions they make in real life, right? Because there's all this thoughts that maybe your dreams influence the things you do and say. So Mercutio is essentially insinuating that, oh, this fairy must have visited you, Romeo. That is why you are so heartbroken about Rosalind. He's more so, we can probably infer, making fun of Romeo. He probably doesn't really believe in Queen Mab. This scene ends with them arriving to the party. So scene 5, we're at the party. Juliet is hanging out with Paris. They have met. They're dancing, talking, whatever. When Romeo walks in and he spots Juliet and he's like, Rosalind who? This girl's beautiful. And he's like checking out Juliet. While he's doing that, Tybalt, who is Juliet's cousin, a Capulet, spots Romeo at the party. And he's like, what is this Montague doing here? I want to fight him. Montagues can't be at the Capulet's house. And he's getting really angry. And Juliet's dad sees him angry and he's like, what are you so mad about? Tybalt's like, look, there's Montagues here. I want to fight him. And Juliet's dad is kind of like, okay, the Montagues are here, but they're not doing anything. Let's just keep the peace. Calm down. So Tybalt's mad and he's like, I'm going to get Romeo, even if I can't get him now. And then he walks away. So then Romeo walks up to Juliet. He's like, hey, do you want to dance or whatever? And she's like, sure. So they dance. It's kind of love at first sight. And they kiss right there on the dance floor. So they kiss, and then they are interrupted when Juliet's mom calls her away to go do something, and then Romeo and his friends leave. It's not until a little later at the end of the scene when they realize they had kissed their enemy, right? So Romeo's a Montague, Juliet's a Capulet. They realize, oh my gosh, this person who I think I might love is my enemy. It's a really big deal. And that is how Act 1 ends. So some things to consider as we move into Act 2. Think about, how does this society show love? How does it show loyalty? How does it seem to value these things? And then from there, consider, how does that compare to the way we value love and loyalty today? What's similar? What's different?